and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Some images are painful to look at, but it's necessary to show them nonetheless. The reason is that these pictures not only reveal, but also remind us of the tragedies that are swept under the rug by those in power. Such is the case with this picture of a Salvadoran father and his daughter lying face down in the water of the Rio Grande, which is part of the U.S. border with Mexico. Oscar Alberto Martinez, probably driven by poverty and violence back home, hoped to cross the U.S. border with his young daughter, Angie Valeria Martinez, to seek asylum. But President Donald Trump would like for the world to believe that the U.S. is protecting its borders from criminals and thugs, not families risking their lives for a better future. President Trump would also want people to believe that there is a good reason for ripping families apart and putting young, scared children in detention camps without basic facilities like soap, water, and a warm blanket. On tonight's show, we discuss the plight of these migrants and the urgency to humanize them and their stories. Joining us for this show today is Anne Jacob, who's an activist joining us from Malaysia. We're also joined by Mr. Adam Khaze, who's the Director of Home Migration Services, joining us from Perth. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Khaze, let me begin with you. Now, what does this picture tell the world?
I think it's a symbol of the plight of many, regardless of if they're facing religious persecution, violence, or they just live in dangerous conditions. It is the end result of what happens in a worst case scenario. And I think it's a reflection, and the photo itself, we've seen similar pictures with the crisis from Syria, with migrants going from Turkey to Europe, and to Australia as well. Australia's had about 1,900 deaths over 10 years of people, asylum seekers coming to Australia. So I think it's symbolic of the issue we have with the West taking on migrants and what people go through.
Right. And Ms. Jacob, right now we showed this picture, talked about it being a symbol, but we know that these pictures have been coming out, as Mr. Khaze pointed out, in plenty of numbers. We've seen many migrants across the world facing a similar fate. Now, the conversation is always about these people entering the borders, but what about their journey to get to the border? Let's talk about that and how important it is to keep that in perspective.
We do receive a lot of migrants to Malaysia, including refugees. And the journey is very precarious and very hard condition. And there's a lot of factors which is involved in their journey. There's involving trafficking, smuggling, and also people crossing on their own with these borders. And a lot of these borders, especially those who are coming to Malaysia, they are crossing the land border, and so many extortion and abuse happens through this journey. Basically, you know, a lot of where they are held by traffickers, smugglers, and you know, like in 2017, we have the whole the boat people, the Rohingya people who's coming, and then one of the things that we saw at the border of Malaysia and Thailand, a huge massacre have happened, and they have buried the bodies. So these are the things that happens in the journey, and many people's life perish in the journey.
Right. And Mr. Khaze, going back to you and talking a little about what's been happening in the U.S. so far when it comes to migrants and how Trump has continuously come into power on the basis of trying to curb migration, and also has proceeded throughout his journey as president to talk about migrants in this hateful manner. Give us a sense of what has been happening there at the southern border.
Yeah, look, I believe it's a political shift towards making an example, the harsh truth, making an example of migrants. Now, I'm an Australian expert, and although I've been following policy in the US, if I can anchor it back to what's happened in Australia in 2013, and this does link into President Trump's immigration strategy. There was an Operation Sovereign Borders that was introduced by our Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott. Now, since then, the Australian government's managed to keep the borders officially under control. It's taken a turn-back approach, and by setting an example and under any circumstances turning back boats and not allowing people to come to Australia. And even in cases where people have had, there's been deaths and medical emergencies, and still they've struggled to come to Australia. They've set an example and essentially stopped the boats. Now, if we take the same scenario in the US, well, they don't have boats. They've got an actual border, which is a bit more difficult to manage because you don't have Mother Nature on your side and water to combat the boats. But I believe he's taking an approach that he believes that if he's tough and he takes this tough approach and he keeps turning people back and he separates families and essentially commits these human rights violations against many people from South America. Eventually, after a few years, people will stop coming. But I think what the Trump administration doesn't understand completely is where they're leaving from and what they're escaping from in many cases, whether it's poverty or violence, is worse than what possibly the United States is doing in their strategy. So I don't believe it will stop. So I believe he's taking this example by separating families, not letting people in, taking a harsh approach, hoping that after a year or so they'll just give up.
Right, and Mr. Khaze, it's important that you highlight here how this is almost being used as a tool of deterrence in many cases of these human rights violations. But it's also important to remember that the people who are fleeing from these areas, coming to the southern border, many of the circumstances within their home countries have been produced and have been supported by the United States to begin with. On that note, Ms. Jacob, let's talk about how Malaysia has been housing migrants from different parts of the world. And let's talk about how countries in Asia have been supporting refugees flowing in.
Okay, for Malaysia, actually the treatment for refugees, basically Malaysia do not recognize refugee, but even we do not recognize refugee, but there's many refugees who are here. And they do not have any rights for livelihood. Basically, they can't work. So they become basically a kind of a illegal person in Malaysia. So in that case, when they are basically, in our human rights term, we call them as undocumented workers or people. But you can't deny their rights as a human being. Their basic human rights shouldn't be denied based on any identity or whether they have a document or not. So that is basically the situation, and a lot of abuses happens for the refugee, including the migrant workers, especially those who are undocumented. And even for the documented migrant workers, there's always an extortion done by these authorities.
Right. So, Ms. Jacob, what you're saying here is that it's, of course, a global issue, the treatment of refugees and migrants. But let's talk about the numbers. How many people have flown into Asia and have been housed within countries in Asia? Those coming from Myanmar, those coming from Syria, those coming from Afghanistan, all these different places.
Basically, for migrants, we have about about 6,000 to 7,000, and then another 2,000 refugees. I'm not exactly sure how many, but overall we have about 2,000 refugees. So it's kind of a whole big. We don't have an exact statistic of how many, but this is more or less the figure in Malaysia.
Right. And thank you on that note so much for joining us, Ms. Ann Jacob, and talking to us. Mr. Khaze, going back to you, something I do want to touch upon is the UN claiming that 80% of the world's refugees are being housed in developing nations. And yet we see Europe and the United States at the forefront of this migrant crisis when they criticize the migrants flowing in. Let's explore that a little.
Look, I think I'll touch on Malaysia. There was a case in 2011 where the Australian government made an agreement with the Malaysian government called the Malaysian Solution, where it tried to almost bypass the UN Convention by directing it towards Malaysia, so essentially adopting Malaysia as the hub. And the High Court in that instance overturned the case, and basically the conclusion was that the High Court stated because Malaysia is not part of the UN Convention and cannot guarantee the safety of these migrants, as they don't recognize them, they can't facilitate refugees, that a lot of these third countries, they don't have the resources and they're not able to facilitate these refugees. You've got, and another example is in Egypt. I had a recent client whose father migrated or escaped from the Palestinian territories to his grandfather, to Egypt, and in 2 generations, all they held was, to Saudi Arabia, and all they held was Egyptian travel documents that didn't allow them to travel everywhere. So there is a lot of responsibility on the West. However, a lot of the Middle Eastern countries who absorb these people, and as you've mentioned, 80% of the people are still in these third countries that aren't necessarily members of the UN and parties to the convention, need to take some responsibility.
Right, but let's talk about countries. But let's talk about the countries that do have the resources. Let's say the United States, even Australia. We've been hearing about Christmas Island and how migrants would be sent off to there. We've been hearing a lot about this time and time again. We've heard about arguments about refugee cities coming out from Europe as well. Now, these countries, I'm not saying they have plentiful resources, but they are better off than developing nations. Why is it that they're at the forefront, despite not housing so many refugees and migrants, at the forefront claiming that they're under threat?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, we call it the Trump era in Australia, where it's political. So the shift has changed a lot where, in my experience, it's become a tool to gain votes. Like in Australia, it's tipped over the 50% mark where people don't want to see refugees arrive by boats. And the reason for that is how they've come. See, in Europe as well, a lot of these refugees have come from war-torn countries. And every time there's an issue or a refugee breaks a law or there's a violent act in that country, the right wing and in many cases conservative governments have an ability to boost that and make it bigger than it is. So, for example, if one refugee commits a rape or a violent act, they'll take that and symbolize that to represent all the refugees. Now, essentially, the government is a representative of the people. So a lot of times it may shift left or right. Generally, people are sympathetic to the refugees' flight. But what we see in Australia, they're sympathetic, but they don't necessarily want them here. And I do believe that it is a political shift. And
right.
It's linked to things such as the European,
but
the
Mr.
UK
Khaze, that's the irony. As you're mentioning it, people might be sympathetic, but they don't want them within their borders. Now, where does that sympathy get these refugees and migrants fleeing for their lives? On that note, I'd also like to introduce Barrister Aslam, who's an international law expert. He's joining us from London. Thank you so much, Barrister Aslam, for joining us. Now, give us an insight into the legal framework of when people try to seek asylum within a country. Can they be turned away?
Thank you very much. First of all, when they apply asylum, they have to be heard properly. They have to be conducted. Actually, firstly, they have to conduct a screening interview, then a full interview. And during that time, they have to provide a shelter, a food, proper care, plus, minimum stationery like pens, cigarettes, and these sort of things, like basic facilities which should be provided in any detention. It should be provided in U.S. detention centers as well. And the law which governs these rules is the 8th Amendment of U.S. Constitution. So in this one, they can't be punished cruelly. They can't be leave like that in sort of bad situations. Like the children were kept in these situations in U.S. detention centers. So laws are very clear about detention. Secondly, there is a refugee law. Which governed by
Barrister Aslam, just on that point where you're saying that the law is clear about how to house these migrants and the asylum seekers, you're mentioning that they must be provided with basic necessities. Now, the reports coming in from those who have visited the detention camps and detention sites within the southern border in the U.S. have claimed that there are children as young as 5 months old, but they don't have clean clothes, they don't have water to take showers for over a month, they don't have food, they have to stand up because there's overcrowding. Is this legal or illegal under international law?
Yeah, under United Nations Convention for Human Rights, they can separate children from their father or mother or their parents, but they have to provide proper shelter. Like they can transfer those children to any families who can provide proper care, food, bed, and every basic necessities of facilities. It can't be lived like that. You can't leave children in that inhuman conditions, like people saw the photos and videos, lawyers visited those detention centers. It can't be treated in that manner. Like laws are very clear. There are some basic principles which U.S. government has to follow, which has not been followed.
Right.
If you see the pictures, they were in dirty clothes. They were in bad conditions. Food were not properly provided to them. So U.S. government has violated their basic laws and basic principles, which, yeah.
Right. And Barrister Aslam, hold on to that thought. Mr. Khaze, while we're talking about the minimum standard, the minimum humanitarian standard that needs to be maintained, what more insight can you give us into this situation? Because the standard seems to be quite arbitrary, to be frank.
Yeah, look, we have to be very careful we don't cross lines, because the UN Convention outlines the standards through its articles. And for example, refugee has free access to the courts of law. When exercised, the right by a refugee would normally require the assistance of authorities. The authorities have to help. However, that applies to refugees. The way the governments in Australia and in America, United States, get around this is they're not necessarily treating them like refugees. So we can't necessarily apply the UN Convention. Now, they're people who are migrating over whose claims in many cases still have not been assessed. So what Trump would be saying is, well, they're just illegal aliens. They're people trying to get into our country. They haven't been assessed by the United Nations. So there's a difference between the people that are undocumented and coming over the Mexican border to, for example, people from Afghanistan who've escaped and gone into Pakistan, registered with the United Nations, and have a United Nations certificate that authorizes them as a refugee.
Mr. Khaze, would a refugee only be categorized as who's fleeing conflict?
Persecution, it has to be for religion, race, social group, or gender. The Australian government does have complementary protection provisions for people who are under threat that are fleeing violence. However, in many cases, if there's no evidence or those claims have not been assessed, all you really have are a large number of people who claim they're fleeing violence, and whether they are or not is not the question. It's how the government justifies it, and they may just be justifying that these people are claiming such, but they haven't been founded by the United Nations. So a strategy could be for the United Nations to open up offices on the border and actually assess these people, provide them with certifications as refugees, and that would make the United States job very difficult.
All right. Hold that thought. I also want to introduce Ms. Azra Banu, who's the chairperson of Care Refugees, an NGO providing relief to refugees in Malaysia. She's joining us from Kuala Lumpur. Thank you so much, Ms. Banu, for joining us. Now, we're talking about how countries would justify ill treatment, going around the UN conventions and stuff. Now, tell us, with Trump in power, how have countries, or do you see an increasing trend in countries justifying more harsh treatments against migrants? Do you see that influence?
Oh, yes, definitely. There's definitely a spillover here in Malaysia. We hear the same rhetoric against refugees. In fact, they are lumped together with illegal economic migrants, right? We should just get conflated, and they are seen as a threat to the local population in so many aspects, employment, competition for employment, health. They bring in diseases, they bring in insecurity or criminal activity. So I see the same rhetoric being the common discourse here in Malaysia.
Right. And with that, how do you feel like, what are the basics when it comes to children, when you are trying to protect children, whether even if they are illegal economic migrants' children? What are the basic standards that should be maintained?
Education and health, I say that again and again, right? They need access to good health care and education. But the problem stems from them here, at least in Malaysia, not being given legal access to employment. So with that being denied, brings a host of other problems. And healthcare and education are the biggest compromises in their lives. And each time, that's where we prefer to support here in our NGO, for example. We support refugee schools, but refugee schools themselves, they don't have the funds. So everything, they just lack everything, all the facilities and teachers and poor teachers, poor education standards. So I would say healthcare and education as far as the children are concerned.
Right. And Barrister Aslam, we've been talking about legalities, but if you give us a final say about what has been happening in the United States in terms of migrants and the children there, has that gone against U.S. law? Or because the court hearing also stated that the government violated laws here, but the Trump government is trying to defend it. What would your say be on that?
In US, there are, as I said, there are 2-3 laws which they have to follow. Like first law is Prison Litigation Reforms Act, that's called RLPA as well. So according to that, when anybody has taken to detention, he has to provide basic human, all facilities under basic human rights, like food, shelter, clothing, everything. And plus, if there is a case going on, he has to provide appeal right. He has to give an access to lawyers, or if he hasn't got any lawyer, lawyers will be appointed by the U.S. government. So all these rules has been already violated by U.S. government. And secondly, their rules are very clear. Their section 1158 is very clear. Any person who is in detention or custody, that person should be given all basic human rights, all basic rights, legal rights and everything.
And
So
Barrister Aslam,
that,
on that point of basic human rights, I just want to ask you if this is correct or not. The U.S. law does state that after 72 hours, and I'm talking about minors who have been separated from their parents, the children will be transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services, and then they will be taken to a relative within the U.S. that's nearest to them. Now, this has obviously not been happening in the detention centers. Is this a law that is being violated?
Yes, it is. If they have got any relative, that child will be transferred to that relative. If they don't have any relative, then he'll be sent to proper foster care to families who wants to adopt that person, and that families will be paid for that care, whatever they will provide, and he will be provided proper education, food, and everything, which I think has been violated.
Right. And Mr. Khaze, let's talk a little about the trend towards migrants. Now, like we began the show, we talked about how a picture like this almost seems to emerge after every refugee crisis. And now one has emerged for the crisis that it's taking place in the southern border. Do you think this will soften the hearts of those people who have been so vehemently against migrants?
Look, you've got different groups. You've got people that are on that are fence sitters, and I think a lot of people will be persuaded in support of migrants and their struggle. However, you've got the people that are adamant, the same right-wing extremists in America that are uneducated and easily conveyed by Trump's messages, and I don't think they will be. I don't think they're even going to be influenced by this, because they're very easily influenced by propaganda from the Trump administration. So I think it will influence a lot of people who are on the border and aren't involved to speak up and go, you know what, we don't like to see children dying, trying to just move to a different country. We don't like to see families dying on the way, and we don't like to see them locked up. So I think it will change and shift, but it's something that will take time, and one photo alone will not be enough. It would be something that has to continue on. And
it seems like the state and the conditions in the U.S. are pretty bleak because the House has passed a $4.5 billion amount to provide healthcare services to these people, but it's expected to be vetoed. So it seems like that political struggle will still remain.
Yeah, it's something you can't really pass. And as I said, we saw very similar things in Australia, and we've had the same government for nearly four or 5 years now. So I don't believe you're going to get much traction. They may be able to stop Trump or slow him down, but I don't think you'll get much change until honestly a government changes. We've seen other things that happened in the past, and he's quite stubborn. His stance on Iran, for example. So I think this will be something the same, that essentially the families and the children that are trying to migrate here are being used as propaganda, and they're going to keep being used as such until the government changes.
Right. And Ms. Banu, on that note, how do you think their stories need to be humanized in order for them not to be used as propaganda, but to be seen as real people with real lives?
Over here, what we tend to do is we organize, we hold activities that bring the people together, the Malaysians and the refugees together. We just had one recently last week, and through this interaction, we hope to see a difference. But just on the touch on the point of government, we've had a change in government last year, and the current government has a softer stand towards refugees. In fact, it was in their election manifesto to give them access to legal employment. It hasn't happened, but we're seeing encouraging signs, and we hope to build on that over here.
Right. And on that note, thank you so much, Ms. Azra Banu, for talking to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. A report by Global Monitor found that people living in high-income countries have the lowest levels of confidence in vaccines. Moreover, people in Western Europe have been found to have the highest levels of distrust in vaccinations. The impact of these anti-vaccine sentiments is reflected in the World Health Organization's numbers. In the first 2 months of 2019, more than 34,000 measles cases were reported in 42 countries over Europe. On tonight's show, we discuss why the anti-vaccine movement is gaining ground and whether there is a systematic campaign in the back end, which is creating fear from the use of these life-saving vaccinations. Joining us on the show tonight is Mr. Alexis Poulin, a journalist joining us from France. We're also joined by Professor Beate Kampmann, who's a professor of pediatric infection and immunity and the director of the Vaccine Center at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She is joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us. Professor Kampmann, let me begin with you. Now, take us through the main reasons why people are increasingly finding it difficult to trust vaccinations.
Okay, well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to comment on this really important report. The first thing I want to say is that 8 out of 10 people are still completely confident in vaccinating their children, and we should not forget that this is actually quite a small number of people who are making an awful lot of noise for probably all the wrong reasons. However, we need to listen to this noise because it is starting to erode the trust and the confidence in vaccines that there should be. So why is this happening in Europe? Well, Europe has seen hardly any of the diseases that we are successfully vaccinating against. So in a sense, we are victims of our own success because 20, 30 years ago, people would be seeing people with measles maybe, and people with pneumonia, people with meningitis. They would have the experiences in their own children. And now the children are so much more healthy because of all the vaccines around, and people's risk-benefit ratio elaborations have kind of turned themselves upside down. And now, because they don't see the diseases, they think having a sore arm for a day or so, or looking critically at the ingredients.
So it's a certain sense of complacency on the part of these people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the particular issue with measles, why it's come to a head, is because you have to have 95% of the population immunized in order to have what we call community protection or herd protection. And that's a high number of people to reach. So even if you've got 10% of people who are not confident, you jeopardize that vaccine coverage. And this is somewhat a knock-on effect of the overall dismissed connections between MMR vaccine and the possible links to autism, which are completely untrue. But we're now seeing some of the fallout of those sorts of discussions many years later because the herd immunity has dropped.
Right. And just to talk about that 95% goal that the World Health Organization has also set, could you just elaborate a little more on that?
Sure. So the 95% goal is quite specific to measles because measles is a highly infectious virus. And literally for every one person in the room with measles, there'll be at least another 2 who will get infected if they haven't had the infection before or if they hadn't had the vaccine before. So that is a very infectious condition. And because if you have herd immunity. It means that even people who are not vaccinated can be protected. But because measles is so infectious, you really have to have 95% of the people who've had. So it's disease specific. It's not something that the WHO made up. It's a number that comes from the infectiveness of measles.
Right. Hold on to that thought. I do want to ask Mr. Poulin, is joining us from France as well. And France in this report was seen to have the lowest rate of trust in vaccinations. Is this making local headlines in France? Are people talking about the fact that they are considered to be a population which has the least trust in vaccinations?
No, not in France, not as such. Mainly, it is pointed that, for example, countries like Italy with the five-star movement, who is really anti-vaccine, saying that those countries are more anti-vaccine than France. But it's coming. We have some people who have been elected to the European Parliament, French politicians who are anti-vaccine. And there is this growing lack of confidence in the labs. The problem is mainly that big pharmas like Sanofi and others are entrenched in cases in courts because of what they did and what they covered, knowing that some medicine were harmful to either be the embryo or even people. And the fear that there is lack of information about vaccine, about what could be the side effects, lead a lot of French people to avoid because, as it was said, a lot of French citizens are already vaccinated. So the logic is saying, oh, well, if so many people are vaccinating, why should I go or why should I ask my kid to go? And here comes the problem because there is a threshold of people to be vaccinated to make sure that disease don't come back.
Right.
And that's what people don't see.
Right. But something here that Professor Kampmann pointed out, which was very interesting, was the fact that there is a very small number of people who are making quite a lot of noise when it comes to anti-vaccination. And it gets us wondering whether these people who are making all of this noise have a very systematic approach to this.
No, and they don't have access to mainstream media. I mean, that's why you will find them in mainly social networks and conspirationist websites or others, because they tend not to have the microphone to talk about their fear of vaccine. But clearly, this is a political strategy. It was used, for example, during the campaign from Donald Trump to use the anti-vax campaign to sort of gain some more voters in these areas, saying we should target these people, so let's go and work to get our message across and start with an anti-vaccine message, but then you come up with a pro-Trump message in the end. So it is a strategy that has been designed by campaigners, and it is used, of course, as a political strategy. We don't see much of the anti-vax as being voicing and talking in France. As I said, they are in power in Italy with the five-star movement, for example. It's clear on their program that they don't believe in vaccine, and the health minister is not a pro-vaccine minister. It's not the case in France, where all the authorities are very pro-vaccine and trying to counter the anti-vaccine wave that is coming in.
Right. Professor Kampmann, going back to you, could you tell us a little about the encounters you've had with people who have these very deep-rooted fears regarding vaccinations? You mentioned complacency as being one cause, but could there be more to this?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I think we need to say is that doctors do not intend to do harm through vaccines, and parents also do not want to make decisions that harm their children. So we need to, err on the side of making people communicate better. So the main concerns that I hear from parents, and I'm a practicing pediatrician as well, is that they don't know what is in vaccines and that the information about the ingredients is not accessible to them in a way that they can see it. Right. So obviously there is a lot of lack of opportunity there for people to follow up on safety information, because every single vial of a vaccine has an insert that tells you precisely what's in a vaccine. And it's actually written in a way that people can understand it. So I don't think people feel empowered to ask for that information leaflet when they go to wherever they get their vaccines and can see the information, which is why a lot of the crazy information can, snowball on the social media chains, because it's not fact-checked. There is a lot of safety information from the vaccine companies and also from academic institutions, because people have hopefully still a tendency to trust what the academic institutions say. We don't make money from giving vaccines to children, right? We want to do the right thing that has protected gazillions of lives. But the access to safety information, I think we can improve. And what you probably also saw in the report from the Wellcome Trust is that actually 2/3 of people take the information through their healthcare provider. So if the healthcare providers are the ones that are giving the information in an accessible way, I think we can break through some of this. And I will encourage any of my colleagues to actively seek the dialogue with families who might have reservations. And a lot of people are not completely anti-vax. There is a group of people who will always vaccinate, which is good. There's a group of people who are going to be extremely difficult to convince, and that's a small group, and they make a lot of noise. And then there's a group in the middle, maybe some 10-15% of people who are hesitating, and those are the people.
So, Professor Kampmann, it seems like you're talking about how engagement, as you stated, is the key role here and the key factor. But with this epidemic that's taking over Europe, and I will call it an epidemic, we are seeing a record number of measles cases, especially in the US and in France and other places. They are rising significantly as well. Is there a systematic effort to counter this? Is there policies being put in place in order to counter this?
Of course. So the first question that comes up, should vaccination be mandatory? And Alexis, you live in a country where since the last 2 years, several vaccines have been made mandatory. There used to be 3 vaccines mandatory in France. They've added 8, so now there's 11. And the vaccine coverage in France has increased significantly. So in Italy, that was also put into law, and people were being fined if they didn't have the way to vaccinate their children before they went to school. I don't personally believe that that is the way that we're going to convince the individual to make an informed choice. Why? Because I think we want to win the argument by persuasion rather than coercion. But I do understand that there is a fine balance between an outbreak where we have to really respect the public health imperative and the personalized
But is it a personal choice? This is the question that arises when people talk about vaccinations becoming mandatory. Is it a personal choice if it affects someone else's kid?
So, of course, it's a personal choice, but people often do not understand that their personal choice impacts on other people. I mean, you've got the examples in Pakistan. You know, the polio campaign in Pakistan is a real challenge, and it has been politicized beyond description, and people have made choices for various reasons. And they don't understand that the individual choice also has implications for the wider society, because I don't think people understand the concept of protecting those who can't have the vaccines by their personal decisions. We need to explain it.
Right. Mr. Poulin, going back to the idea of this being a systematic campaign, now a report came out which saw that a wealthy New York couple donated $3 million to the anti-vaccine movement, Bernard Sees and his wife. Now, this is a very significant amount of donation. They usually donate to different cultural and conventions and museums, but they are donating to this movement. So there is something more happening at the back end, no?
Of course, as I said, it's a Trojan horse. It's with the anti-vax movement, you touch a lot of people who are not interested in politics. And you can actually start with the anti-vax saying, you know, oh, it's something that is close to you and yourself, with your family, your personal space, and slowly moving to political ideas. And as I said, it was used during the campaign of Donald Trump. They used the anti-vax groups already. And it's theorized. It's something that you can do, and you can use other groups. But the anti-vax is quite widespread because it's across all political colors. It's any people, and mostly people who are far from politics. So they won't see the political message. They will only see the anti-vax message. But slowly and surely, will come the why don't you vote for this guy because he will not force you to get your vaccine done. Why don't you vote for this guy because he trusts you in your choice? And that's how it works. So we have to be careful, but as it was said, coercion is not a good way. I mean, it's the fastest way to do it, but people are still, the problem is the lack of trust in big pharmas. And as I said, there's been too many affairs with the big pharmas in the past years, and people are not trusting these companies anymore, saying they are in it for profit, they're not here for health or the benefit of mankind. And partly it's true. That's sad, but true. So there is a lot of work to be done, not only by
and Mr. Poulin, it seems like this fake news that you mentioned has a political agenda behind it. It's spreading across social media especially. What do you think these platforms are doing to counter these narratives? Or do you think they are just being open to the conversation and letting people decide for themselves?
Well, so far they were very open to conversation, but more and more the platforms are working with the states to sort of put a censorship on the speech. And the problem is where start and end the censorship, and it can be a political censorship. So you have to be very careful about this. It's your right not to believe in vaccine, fair enough, but you have to prove it somehow. The problem is that the bubble is, becoming bigger and bigger, and as said, it can be used for political purposes. But the platform are not the one that should be making the law. It is to the government to have the right legislation in place to prevent any disinformation. And we're trying hard, but it's a difficult thing to do. And the fine line is not to cross and come into political censorship.
Right. And Professor Kampmann, just putting my last question to you, if you had to give a message out to people who are still hesitant about vaccinations and still wonder whether they're safe or not, what would your message be?
My message would be vaccinating is safer than not vaccinating, and vaccines are life-saving interventions, and you should have a right to have them.
Right. That's a very brief but a very sharp note there. On that, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.